Namaskar. The goal of yoga is oneness with the divine. We achieve that by applying the principle that we become what we focus on. So we become the divine by focusing on the divine. But how do you focus on the divine? It's not something we're used to. It's not something we're taught in school. It's a totally different type of thinking from what we're used to. And it's a new type of thinking that we have to learn and practice. So this video is about that. Here are 6 steps that you can use to help you focus on the divine. Step 1, I disengage from the world and my body by shrinking myself down to a tiny point. Step 2, I imagine divine light surrounding my point permanently and totally. Step 3, I imagine the borders of that divine light expanding infinitely. Step 4, I cultivate the feeling of service to that divine light. Step 5, I surrender doership of the meditation by imagining the divine light meditating on me. Step 6, I maintain unflinching attention. So now let's look at each of those steps in a little more detail. Step 1, I disengage from the world and my body and shrink myself down to a tiny point. The divine is around us, present all the time, and we want to be aware of that, and we want to be in a relationship of love with the divine. But when we are engaged with the world, when we are engaged with our body, when we are engaged with any limited thing, that engagement acts like putting on a suit of armor or a suit of clothes that keeps us separate from the divine. And you can't make love with a suit of armor separating you from your beloved. First, you have to take off that suit of armor. I wrote a poem about this once. It goes like this: leave your thoughts upon the balcony, slip from your body gently, for only without mind can you know me, and only without arms can you hold me. So the poem is from the point of view of the divine talking to the devotee. So when we shrink ourselves down to a point, that effort to do that helps. As you pull yourself into a point, you're pulling yourself away from those limited objects that you have been engaged with, and you step back and away from that armor, that wall that keeps you separate from the divine. So this step of shrinking down to a point just frees you up and makes you naked, it just removes the borders and boundaries that separate you from what is already there. The divine is present, but our engagement with the world kind of creates this wall. So step back, pull yourself to a point, and step out of that armor, step out of those clothes, and leave yourself vulnerable and exposed to love, to divine light. Step 2, I imagine divine light surrounding my point permanently and totally. I like the image of divine light. It's at the same time something spiritual and something tangible. And notice that I use the words permanently and totally. So we're trying to get something expansive. We want to expand ourselves, our consciousness, from limited to limitless. So we try to imagine something total, something infinite, not only in space, but in time. So the word permanent, right? We are meditating on that which is beyond change, which is permanent. So as much as you can, try to make that image big. Inside, big and total. Inside, outside, everywhere, past, present, and future. So there's a nice phrase that I like to use when I'm teaching this process of visualization, ideation, and that is simplify, beautify, magnify, identify. Simplify, only divine light, nothing else, pure and simple. And the mind gets peace from simplicity. Beautify, I'm thinking about something incredibly beautiful, divine light. Magnify, I make that total as big as I can, inside, outside, permanent. And the last one, identify. So not only am I focusing on that, but I'm kind of leaning into it and trying to mix my sense of self with it. Right? So I imagine that divine light, but I have the intention to connect with it. I lean into it. I try to mix myself with it. Step 3, imagine the borders of that divine light expanding continuously and infinitely. So we're not meditating on something static. And when we, try to imagine something infinite, however hard we try, it's going to be still limited. So to get around that, imagine that divine light continuously expanding. And as those borders move further and further out and out, what happens is that your consciousness will start to fill up that empty space, right? So your consciousness, as those borders are expanding and receding, your consciousness is breaking out of its normal boundaries and following those borders, expanding and filling up that space. And as that happens, that brings about a sense of flow in the meditation, which is a very special and it's an exciting feeling that one's consciousness is expanding and flowing. Step number 4 is I cultivate a feeling of service towards that divine light. And when I make this effort, it creates a feeling of sweetness, a kind of a personal feeling of intimacy, a feeling of selflessness. So rather than trying to get something, I'm trying to give something. So whenever we are making an effort, a selfless effort, that's expansive itself for the mind. It stretches us beyond the ego. It helps us think of something greater. So how do I serve the divine? Simple, by offering your attention. Just like when you're having a conversation, you contribute to the conversation by being a good listener, by giving your full attention to your partner. So similarly, in meditation, you serve the divine by offering your attention. Step number 5 is I surrender the doership of the meditation by imagining that the divine light is meditating on me. So even after we apply the 4 steps that I've been talking about, the question still remains, to what extent can a finite human mind encompass or merge with the infinite? To what extent can a limited human mind break out of all the bondages that hold us limited and become absolute? Those who are wise and have a lot of experience say that it's impossible for a finite human mind to do that on its own. Or even if it were theoretically possible, it would take such a long time as to make it virtually still out of reach. But the good news is that, we don't have to do it alone. Meditation is a process of connection with the divine, and the divine can play a role if we allow it. So many spiritual traditions say that if you take one step towards the divine will take 20 steps towards you. So that indicates that really in this process of becoming one with the divine, we make some efforts, but most of what happens ultimately is done by the divine. So consciously trying to step out of the way and let that happen, we call that surrender. And the way we do that in meditation is by consciously cultivating the thought that the divine is meditating on me. So we are replacing the thought, I meditate, I think, I do, which actually strengthens the ego boundary. We are replacing that thought with, you are meditating, you are seeing me, you are the subject, which, when we do that, expands the mind, surrenders our sense of ego doership, and hands it over. So that's the trick, is to replace this I meditate, I do, with the feeling you meditate. As our master Sri Sri Ananda Murti says, you think, I have surrendered everything to you. But if you can surrender that feeling of I, the I in the I surrender, then only is the process complete. And the way to do that is, you are meditating, you are thinking, you are seeing me. There's a beautiful story our master tells, which gives a useful image that you can use in meditation. So the story is, one day there's a doll made of salt who wakes up and decides that today I will measure the sea. So he jumps into the sea and begins his process of measurement, but at some point he's lost. So imagine when you're doing the meditation that you are that salt doll and the divine light surrounding you is the sea, and rather than you embracing it, the sea, that sea of divine light is steadily absorbing you, dissolving you into itself. So surrender, to take that final part of the journey, which is beyond our limited human mind. We have to step back, hand over the process of meditation, and let the divine light finish it. Step number 6, I maintain unflinching attention. Trying to hold all these 5 points in the mind can be very intense. Even one of them can be very intense. And the mind doesn't always feel comfortable with that intensity and seeks to escape and go to something easier. But then when we do that, we lose that possibility of really making a breakthrough. So it's important to resist that tendency of the mind to seek something easier. And what I say to myself is, don't flinch, hold your attention. And I find that when I do that, it really strengthens my power of concentration, and it helps me break through to deeper states of meditation. So to conclude, we'll come back to the question we started with. How do you actually focus on the divine? How do you think of the divine? It's a very common question, especially for new meditators. So here are 6 steps that you can use to do that. If you can get all of them happening at once, it's amazing. If you can even get one of them happening, it's very powerful. So I hope you find them useful, and have a good week.